Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk on accessible storytelling, co-organized by Yale Center Beijing and Yale Club of Beijing. This talk is part of Lux and Veritas 光明与真理 Speaker Series. 这个是我们的校训 which model after college teas at Yale 14 residential colleges. And today's event is actually the first talk in this series. My name is Jingjing, the program and office manager of Yale Center Beijing. For those of you who are new to the center, Yale Center Beijing is the Yale University's first and only university-wide center outside of the US. So throughout the years, we host programs and events that bring thought leaders from diverse sectors to engage in discussions on the most cutting-edge, interesting, and important topics. So today we are very excited to have our two Yale alumni, Jingjing Xiao and Ruoji Guo, joining us this center. So Jingjing is currently a year Qing academic student, and Ruoji actually gonna start his academic journey at Cambridge University this year, right? They both majored in English during their time at Yale. So Ruoji is our moderator today, right? So without further ado, I'll now hand over the microphone to Ruoji.
So hi, I'm Ruoji Guo. I was an English major at Yale, and towards the end of this year, October, I'm going to be heading to Cambridge to do an MPhil in Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic. Jingjing is a 学姐 that I did not know I had. Surprisingly, we went to the same residential college in Yale as well. What are the chances? She is doing something that I have dreamt of doing since I wanted to study English, actually, creative writing. And I did not have I chose a different path. I went to study literature and analytical writing, but I still love creative writing, and I'm sure Jingjing's love and passion for writing is something we are all excited to hear about. We've talked about this, and I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to share. So let's welcome my 学姐 Jingjing Xiao.
Thank you, Rosie. So as a writer, I believe in letting my work speak for itself, so I'll start by reading from an excerpt of my story. Let's play a game. You are my grandfather. Your name is, you have no name. Your parents died so young, you cannot remember what they looked like, much less what they called you. Your first memory is a patch of weeds wagging like dogtails beside the dirt road. A lanky girl running ahead of you to the landlord's courtyard. One silk slipper, the toes tapping the door frame behind her bare brown feet. Ever since you could remember, you had followed your elder sister around the countryside, begging work from wealthy farmers and scavenging the fields when they gave nothing. The seasons cycle, 8 or 10 summers. You become 11 or 13. No one who knows your birth date remains alive. One clear date, your sister brings you a man on horseback who wears a uniform the same color as that cloudless morning. He's your shushu, she tells you. Shushu can mean anything from uncle to stranger. You look towards his face and wonder if you will find a trace of the parents that you do not remember. From behind him, the sun is bright, the sky glows blue, and the light blinds you. Your sister meant uncle, you decide, because as soon as you squint, the man in the blue uniform takes off his nice cloth cap with the red star and sets it on your head. The brim falls over your eyes. Your uncle makes adjustments until the hat balances just so on your hairline. Then he takes your hand, you take your sister's, and the three of you go to dinner. You will remember that meal forever. There were 4 types of crystal noodles made of milky white green bean jelly, pale yellow soybean jelly, and translucent silver sweet potato jelly. The first two change colors in boiling water, turning transparent before the cook scooped them into bowls with his cloth net. A young woman seasoned them according to your uncle's instructions with a dozen ingredients: soy sauce, chili oil, chili flakes, chili powder, spring onions, minced garlic, crushed pepper, taken from a rainbow of plastic dishes. That summer, you learn some people get not 1 or 2, but 3 meals a day. Your uncle stays until autumn, when another uniformed man arrives and tells him he must return to the Red Army. War is no place for a young girl, he says, avoiding the gaze of your sister. Though her eyes water, her voice does not falter. You will grow up to be a man, she tells you, and your uncle agrees with a sigh. If you wish, he will bring you with him to the Red Army in Chengdu. So this story is interactive, as with the Choose Your Own Adventure games and books that I read growing up. I will give you a list of choices, tell you how many there are, and we're going to take a vote, and your vote will decide which way the story goes. There are 2 choices here. First, if you want to go with your uncle. Second, if you want to go with your sister. If you go with your uncle, raise your hand. All right, we have 2 votes, 3 votes. I am going to guesstimate the number of votes. If you go with your sister, raise your hand. All right, we have more votes for going with your sister. In the following years, you wander from job to job, landlord to landlord, at first with your sister, then by yourself, after one landlord marries her. As you till, plant, weed, fertilize, harvest, preserve, and then try not to freeze or starve, the tides of history sweep through China, sometimes literally. The civil war between the Kuomintang, the warlords, the Japanese, the new Red Army means that no faction has time for governance. Everyone neglects routine chores, like clearing the silt deposits on the Yangtze riverbanks. The accumulated sediment and 1931's heavy spring rain combine into torrential flooding. If you could read, the newspapers would have given you nightmares about walls of water appearing by night to sweep entire cities away into darkness. You do not live by the river, so the spring floods are distant hearsay. Then came autumn. There's no work for you, because flooding destroyed the fields. Begging outside the tea house gets you little to nothing. Food is too expensive to give away. You grow thin at first. Then your stomach bloats. Then you die of starvation. To reconsider your previous choice, go to page 1. So, to the people who chose to go with your uncle, you've survived this step of the game. So, after having chosen to go to Chengdu with your uncle, he can leave your birth date blank, but the Red Army registrar needs a name. At your helpless look, your uncle picks Yi Quan. Yi, he tells you, means morality and sensibility, the strength of character to do good and the competence to do it well. Quan means completely. As he explains, your uncle sketches the characters on the edge of your registration form. E is easy, 2 crossing lines and a dot. Quan is slightly more complicated, with 7 strokes comprising the square character. You copy all line 9s onto the spot for your signature on the enrollment list. Then, your uncle gives you his last name, Xiao. Your new family name is written like Little Moon, he explains, showing you how the 3 dots of the little character crown the crescent-shaped moon character. After you copy his neat script with your uncertain scrawl, your uncle hands in the paper. The registrar gives you a pack of supplies, from a shiny new canteen to a blanket that smells odd to a smaller version of your uncle's blue uniform. This time, the red starred hat fits perfectly on your head. As you leave the dry goods stores that serves as the Red Army's makeshift office and storage, your uncle tells you that your family once had a different last name. The emperor who began your line more than a millennium ago, had been known as a patron to artists and writers, but his descendants were usurped by a new dynasty. Those that survived the purge changed their names to deter assassins into the Little Moon Xiao, which was pronounced just like your original name, but written with different radicals. You briefly wonder if that story is true, because you would have changed your last name to Li, Wang, or something else that neither looked nor sounded like your original last name. Then, a candy maker distracts you on your way to the barracks with the motion of spinning brown sugar into lanterns, houses, and animals. You imagine walking through the capital city, returning to a palace painted violet, where you will review the latest work by the leading novelists of your era, over green bean soup chilled with ice cubes shipped in the front from the north, alongside red bean jelly that melts with every bite, and sugar molasses spun into dragons ascending the sky. You're assigned non-combat roles first. The quartermaster sends you to bunk with other kids your age. When the night has set, but nobody feels tired enough to sleep, some little red ghosts brag about the landlords and the Japanese soldiers they killed. But most work is propaganda, with the theater troops that deploy alongside every battalion. They raise troop morale and educate other peasants about the Red Army's efforts to liberate them from landlords. Since you can't read lines or write scripts, you're sent to tend horses. All the best equipment, including mounts, go to the soldiers on the front lines. The remainder get used by officers and staff at base camp. Your work makes both parties notice your intelligence and charm. A captain declares that you've as much courage as any man. A bureaucrat hints your cleverness would serve well in espionage. You must pick one of two positions. First, you can go to the front lines, or second, you can become a covert operative. So let's have a raise of hands. If you go to the front lines, raise your hand. All right. If you become a covert operative, here we go. You leave Chengdu during the season when yellow flowers open to greet the spring. By the time you return, their companion leaves have traded verdant coats for gold and began dancing from their branches into the autumn wind. For the most part, what you do when you disappear for months at a time is a secret that they will bury with you. There are rumors of you escorting General M or Governor L through Sichuan province, but those are rumors. Cover stories for your true missions, perhaps, or simple errands, not missions at all. By the time you have a household and insatiably curious children, you have learned to give non-answers or to deflect and redirect their attentions. Your elder daughters are sensitive enough to read the room and know what not to ask. Your younger sons can ask little when they're stuffing their mouths with sweetmeats. When they grow up, they will remember little of your covert missions outside the treats you brought home, from entire sheep to a fish so big you had the spine joints made into a tobacco pipe, to candies and preserved fruits in rainbow plastic and aluminum. Your sons remember cleaning the wrappers in the sink before they went to school. They gave the scraps to their elder sisters, who folded frogs that jumped, cameras that flashed, and cranes that flapped their wings when you pulled the tails. Those are the stories that they tell their children, so that years later, when your granddaughter writes about you, she has little idea how to describe the covert operations in which you participated, and instead directs her readers to learn more about your participation in battle, like this. To learn more about how my grandfather fought for the Red Army, go to page 6. All right, I would pay attention to this part because it's leading to one of the choices where you're more likely to die out of the others, and I would be curious to see how many people survive. Your Red Army is the weakest force struggling for control of China in the 1920s. You learn this after you go to the front lines, because everyone you fight is better fed and better equipped, from the mercenaries in the Kuomintang in dark green to the Japanese in olive. The rifle you loot from a warlord's foot soldier works better than your issued gun, but even then, you rarely shoot the rifle. You barely have enough ammunition to fill its chambers. The Red Army wages guerrilla warfare. It's the only way you can win against superior forces. For what you lack in equipment, training, and numbers, you make up for with knowledge of the local terrain and peasant support. The work of your little red ghosts in propaganda enable you and the other men in steel blue uniforms to enter any village and become welcomed as heroes. The peasants' army will liberate the villagers from perpetual poverty. by eliminating the landlords and redistributing the farmland. The propaganda songs and theater have become so popular that the Kuomintang soldiers will sneak off to watch performances. Other peasants feed, shelter, and protect you when the hostile militias come knocking. Everyone has heard your stories, and they trust the blue cap with the red star. Every time you free a village from the landlords in the Kuomintang, some villagers follow you to liberate the next town. Like this, the Red Army grows, and you are promoted from one soldier in a squadron of a dozen to a captain leading a squad to a commander managing captains. Despite being younger than many of the men you command, you have fought longer than most and learned to lead in battle through life and death decisions, like the one you made at Jialing River. As you are leaving the riverside village, holdouts from the defeated warlord militia attacked, critically wounding one of your soldiers. You have his son take some string and a metal bowl from his back, put his guts in the bowl, and tie the bowl against the hole in his stomach. This frees the old man's hands from holding his intestines. You and his son hoist his arms over your shoulders and support him to the riverbank. The nearest hospital is across the water. The nearest bridge is 6 kilometers away. There is a ferryman on the river, less than 100 meters from where you stand. He watched you bundle up your man's stomach as he pushed away from shore, so he and his boat are just out of reach when you approach the water. The fare he demands could buy a meal for every man in your 5 squadrons. You consider swimming to the boat and shoving him off, and forcibly taking him the raft, but the current is swift, and neither you nor your soldiers know how to work a boat. Your squad pulls together all your valuables. Waving the collection in the air brings the ferryman back to shore. By the time his raft touches the pebble beach, your squad is slapping the wounded soldier and scooping water onto his face to keep him awake. He goes into shock on the boat. You carry him to the hospital. Outside the operation room, you overhear one of the doctors speculating. Had the patient arrived a few minutes earlier, they might have been able to clear the leaking intestinal acid burning through the soldier's abdominal cavity and limit the internal scarring that will make digestion difficult as long as he lives, if he lives. The nurses tell you afterward that the stomach wound was deep enough. Scarring should ensure your soldier will never stand up straight without pain. He may want to invest in the expensive plastic waist brace instead of the temporary cloth brace, because he will wear it the rest of his life. The next morning, you return to Chongqing with your squad. A secretary records your oral report before sending you and your team to purchase provisions, with the understanding that the Kuomintang are pushing their way west. This may be the last time you enter a city freely, so you must stock up on supplies for the world ahead. When you go to replace your boots, the shoemaker gives you 3 options. You can buy the canvas shoes that have become the Red Army standard. Your fellow soldiers favor these boots for their affordability. While the cloth isn't as durable, comfortable, or weatherproof as rubber or leather, the remaining money can buy clothing and ammunition for your retreat from the Kuomintang. You can buy the second choice, the heavyweight leather boots, handmade by the shoemaker, which would not only be the most comfortable choice, but also reinforce the image of the Red Army as a people's army by supporting local business. The one risk of this choice is that you do not know where the next step in your journey will take you. Leather won't do well in the swamplands of Yunnan, for example. You have heard horror stories of feet rotting in leather boots as soldiers waded through watery caves and muddy trenches. You can buy the rubber boots, which are waterproof. The pair that the shoemaker keeps in his window display had been shipped in from one of the coastal industrialized cities, Guangdong, Hong Kong, or maybe Macau. The smell of new rubber still fills the store. He guarantees that these boots, built with a decade of Western engineering experience, will keep your feet dry and warm in any weather. You'll risk being too warm, however. The boots don't release moisture, and they'll cost nearly all the money you have, even if you talk the shoemaker into a steep discount. You can also buy nothing. While your boots are well worn, you know from the experience that they should serve a few more months, or several hundred more kilometers. You can always braid your own sandals from straw if they wear through before you buy another pair. And saving money will let you afford supplies that you can't replace, like matches and fire starters for your camps, or bullets for your rifle. So again, there are 4 choices. If you buy the camp, you can buy canvas boots, leather boots, rubber boots, or nothing. If you buy the canvas boots, raise your hand. If you buy the leather boots, raise your hand. If you buy the rubber boots, raise your hand. And then if you buy nothing. So I see the most votes for either rubber boots or nothing. Let's try rubber boots again. Nothing. Nothing it is. The leftover money lets you remain in the city 1 more month to wait for new shipments and stock up on provisions. On the 2nd week, it begins to rain. The drizzle becomes a downpour. The pouring rain turns into water falling from the sky in one solid mass, as if someone had turned on a giant faucet directly over your head. The deluge sweeps through Chongqing at night, in one great wall of water emerging out of darkness. You wake to a column of rain tearing through the doorway. Your last thought is that you must be dreaming. Then the water takes you and you drown. You have died. While your choice of footwear may not avert natural disaster, a different selection might prevent you from dying in the 1931 Yangtze Huai floods. You have 3 options: canvas boots, leather boots, and rubber boots. Canvas boots, leather boots, rubber boots. All right, rubber boots it is. You immediately become convinced that the rubber boots are the single greatest purchase you have ever made. The flatness of the soles takes some getting used to, but you figure out how to stuff rags into the hollow arches beneath your feet. Then, the shoes become supportive while remaining, most importantly, dry. For at least a month, you make it a point to wade through the deepest part of every pothole and puddle. The soldiers under your command may tease you endlessly, but you persist in delighted splashing. There is simply no substitute for the feeling of standing ankle-deep in mud and wiggling your dry, toasty toes. You have worn through and patched the boots twice by the time Chiang Kai-shek's forces surround the Red Army. The rubber seal serves you well as your forces split and retreat northwest into the Himalayas. Then, the earth dries overnight when you go into the Gobi Desert. One of your men, a Guilin scholar with a chipped front tooth, had told you about rain shadows. You told him to watch his feet instead of lecturing you. He was saying something about the mountains blocking the clouds from distributing rain downwind when he slipped and fell off a cliff. The slope looked survivable, but the forest was too dense for you to be certain. 2 of the scholar's friends offered to trace their way back down the mountain, find him, and bring him to the village you passed 2 kilometers ago. Perhaps they survived, but you never hear from them again. You go into the Gobi Desert with less than 5 dozen people, because the rest of your soldiers have chosen to stay behind in the villages or been lost to the mountains. Your men march by night and sleep by day. There's nothing to eat. When you have not seen green in a week, your soldiers lose their footing in the desert. The younger boys and men, older men do not get up. You move on. By the 2nd week, you and your men have reached a tacit agreement to march on silently whenever one of you fall. The men who stop never restart walking, and your throats crack when you try to urge them up. You do not have enough moisture left to cry. When the inside of your belly rubs against your back and the wrinkled skin of your collapsed comrades began to look faintly like jerky, you nibble at your belts. The men who clean the leather off their buckles die first. You stretch out the thin piece of preserved meat so it lasts you 5 days. You march on 2, 3, 4 more days. Your second in command has a thinner build, but also more fat and muscle on his bones from growing up as the son of a small landowner in Yunnan. He sets the pace for the team after your steps begin to slow, and you spend the following day croaking instructions to him for reaching Huining, for regrouping with the Red Army, for which lieutenants to trust with what tasks once you regroup. You watch him lead a dozen men into the sunset that evening, and then lie down in the desert cave. Nibbling on your fingers draws blood. The metallic flavor is unpleasant, but tasting anything other than spit and bile satisfies the hunger, gnawing your stomach enough that you can fall asleep for the last time. You have died of starvation. Perhaps a different boot purchase would sustain you through the Gobi Desert. Do you buy the canvas boots or the leather boots? Canvas boots, leather boots. So we are going with the leather boots. And leather can be eaten. You regret buying leather boots for 2 years. In the wet season, Sichuan grows so humid that you wade through air thick enough to cut with a knife. You come to dread the autumn months when the sweat and the moisture makes the skin slow off your feet like newsprint. Then Chiang Kai-shek assembles the Kuomintang forces and chases your army across China. The long march takes you northwest through the Himalaya mountains. The leather at the cuff of your shoes cools to the point of cracking, but insulates your feet initially until your body heat melts the gathered snow. The water seeps into your socks starting at the left toenail. The cold creeps into your bones so that years later you still hallucinate wetness when you wear boots, even when the shoes are new and rubber and it's summer. The earth dries overnight after you cross the Himalayas, as if the mountains have sucked the moisture out of the land to their north. One of your men, a Guilin scholar who had been inspired to join the Red Army by the writings of Karl Marx, once told you about rain shadows. You never finished that conversation. He was one of those men with such a one-track mind that he couldn't seem to split his focus between speaking and watching where he was going. As he explained rain shadows, his foot slipped against the Mawargai cliffside. You didn't catch him fast enough that time. The slope may have been survivable, but the forest was too dense for you to be certain. You let 2 soldiers trace their way back down the mountain and find him, or bring his corpse to the village you passed 2 kilometers earlier. In the next weeks, the squad under your command split. Soldiers quit the army, fall behind, or die until you have less than 5 dozen people. You've reached the Gobi Desert. Though your men march by night and dig holes to gather water by day, there's nothing to eat. You have not seen a green leaf in a week. Your soldiers lose their footing in the sand. The younger kids and older men do not get up, and you move on. By the second week, you and your men have reached a tacit agreement to march on in silence when one of you fell. The men who stopped never restarted walking, and your throats crack when you urge them up. You do not have enough moisture left to cry. When the inside of your belly rubs against your back and the wrinkled skin of your collapsed comrades begins to look faintly like jerky, you nibble at your belts. The men who cling the leather off their buckles die first, until you learn to stretch out the thin piece of preserved meat so it lasts you 5 days. Then you tear the tongue off your boot, hating yourself for not having kept the chunks that broke off when you were in the mountains. The top of the boot tastes like wax. As you eat your way down, the flavor grows salty and vaguely metallic because the leather has marinated in mud and your sweat. By the time you reach Huining, you are barefoot, but your boots have fed 3 men, 2 of whom survived the long march. In the months after your arrival at Huining, bits and pieces of the squadron under your command stumble into the city. Between these men, their stories, and the reports from the fragmented but growing Red Army intelligence network, you can account for the whereabouts of 3/4 of your men. In your company of more than 500, 67 men and women have completed the long march. 100 more, give or take 50, left the army partway to settle in villages alongside your path. After Mao Zedong negotiates an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek to fight off the Japanese, you begin to receive their letters from provinces around China. One of the kids from the propaganda department reads them to you. You learn that the wounded soldier has brought his wife to his new home. He suspects that they're too old to have another child, but they have effectively adopted the neighborhood urchins, whose leader looks a little like you because his face is long and his ears stick out too far from his head. The other soldiers who remain at Dadu have gotten married, one to a nurse from the hospital by the river. Their children send you greetings and ask for that one hat with the Red Army's star to share between them. Northwest China becomes the home base for the resurgence of the Red Army. The difficult terrain keeps you isolated from the Kuomintang. Fighting off the Japanese gives you time to recuperate and consolidate your bond with peasants around China. You receive proper training for leading your battalion from both native Eastern philosophy and new Western ideas imported by Chinese students abroad. These form the foundation for the army that sweeps the Kuomintang out of the Chinese mainland after the Japanese expulsion. You retire in your late 20s, having walked nearly 6,000 miles with your battalion. You may have left Sichuan as a starving orphan, but you return home as a hero whose choices gave rise to modern China. In the years after your homecoming, you settle into a quiet life in a farmhouse with exposed wooden rafters and meet a woman, your primary schoolmate, a former landlord's daughter. She teaches you to read. You marry her. You have 6 children, the youngest of whom becomes my father. I have some help with give me a moment to organize my thoughts as well as my papers, because there's quite a bit of them. The project I was reading is an excerpt from my senior thesis for the English creative writing department. I was writing creative nonfiction about my grandfather on my father's side, who had been a child soldier in the Red Army. As for me, so my parents immigrated to the US in 2003, moving from the center of Beijing to a 1-bedroom apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. So this is the apartment. I had the bedroom. My parents slept in the living room. And as my mother worked and my father job searched, the books that we could afford came from the public library, where I devoured the children's section, except for a wall of bookshelves holding up Newbery and Caldecott medal winners. My mother wanted me to read those, so naturally, I refused, like any self-respecting teenager. As a first-generation immigrant who grew up in Beijing and Kentucky, I came from a different world than most of my peers at Yale, where 69% of students are in families in the top 20% of the income bracket. Outside of class, my debate club discussed philosophers that I'd barely heard of. So to me, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were S-P-A, SPA, like as in that. That was an acronym I memorized for AP English. While Dante, yeah, obviously this is the platinum blonde dude from the Devil May Cry game series. In lieu of familiarity with the Western canon, I grew up with Chinese history, 上下五千年, computer games, and the genre fiction of my public library. Majoring in English and concentrating in creative writing at Yale was a process of translation. The stories that I've loved since childhood, I learned to stand up for their literary value from professors who not only wrote award-winning books, but also shaped the standards of the English literary world. In turn, the literary texts that we read for class influenced my own stories. I gained new appreciation for the award-winning stories that I had ignored as a child, because literary writing could afford to think less about popularity or sales to focus more on telling stories that matter. What mattered to me, the stories that I was shaped to tell, is giving voice to minority narratives. The Times published this when I was a senior in college. The essay was especially important to me as a Chinese American who had grown up in Kentucky, reading stories that feature little about people who look like me or had experiences like mine. At the same time, I was struck by how the readership of the Times differed from the communities in which I'd grown up in both China and the US. I wanted to write a story that I would have read, which led to a contract for this project. So you won't actually see this project associated with my name. I published it under a pen name last year. It's interactive fiction, which tracks readers' choices and gives different endings based on your performance, like my thesis project. This is actually released on the App Store, so you can buy it now. It's sold a few thousand copies. It's also 250,000 words that I wrote while working full-time and earning a part-time master's degree. This is not an experience that I would repeat for both the quality of my work and my own quality of life. But you learn from every experience. The game was a test run for some concepts that I'm passionate about. It features an international cast, characters who are poor and fabulously wealthy, women navigating difficult social and familial questions. While writing a story I would have liked to read, a game about running a magical tea house in Sichuan, I was also able to address real issues. This is one of my favorite comments from readers in the corner, because Tumblr is great. You can see how we type on Tumblr, but I also wanted to write stories that feel real, while alive with dragons and magical pandas, which leads to my current project. So as I mentioned earlier, the excerpt from my grandfather came from my college thesis, which I'm currently adapting into a book. After hopping the spectrum from nonfiction to fantasy, I'm searching for a middle ground in creative nonfiction. But since I graduated in 2019, COVID has changed the world around us. Even when I tell the same stories, they're being shaped by a context of increasing polarization. I'm grateful to Yale, Beijing, and Kentucky for giving me the confidence in shared humanity from having called many different places home. Past projects have helped me explore how storytelling can put us into the shoes of people with very different experiences. So despite a landscape of growing anti-Asian hatred and violence, I continue to be inspired by the experiences of people like my grandfather, who have seen the worst of the world and continue to believe in goodness.
All right, thank you so much for, yeah. Switch mic real quick. Thank you so much for your sharing your story. Just sit down while I say this. Absolutely amazing. I love the story. Yeah, I have just a couple of questions for you, but throwing this aside for a moment, just about the story. I was wondering what the creative process was like. Were you talking with your grandfather through the whole thing, or was it from like childhood memories of conversations with grandpa? Like how did the whole project came to be?
So some of the background stories is my father is the youngest of 6 siblings. So my grandfather had 6 kids. They're all spaced 2 years apart. My grandmother was a very organized woman. But by the time my father was born, my grandfather was getting up there in years. So he passed when my father was 9. So this is actually, he's someone who haunts me as someone who I haven't had the opportunity to meet. And as a part of the Light Fellowship at Yale between 2017 and 18, I returned between my junior and senior years to China, actually, to do some research supported by Yale on his life, reading from sources about his life, about the Red Army. That led me to work on this project.
That's really cool. And speaking of your life at Yale, would you like to share some experiences of people there who left lasting impressions on you? And what are some, maybe about writing or maybe otherwise?
Yeah, I think there are going to be lots of those, right? This is like 4 years, which is like a significant portion of our lives, especially when we're as young as we are. One person who comes to mind most recently is one of my roommates who studied applied math, who after work, we worked in Chicago, she worked for the government, who is currently in business school. So I think one thing that I learned from a lot of students at Yale is that the admissions office, and like, the admissions office told me, so I am not speaking on behalf of the admissions office, please don't sue me, is that like they're looking for students who are like very good at one particular thing, and then they'll have a well-rounded class. But what I find after coming to campus is like people are also very well-rounded. So I think like one thing that I've really learned from the experience and from those people is like, these are the writing projects you see that have come out, but working as a writer is more you have like 5 balls projects that you're juggling at any given time. There are like opportunities that will show up like goals in the world around you. And then while juggling the balls and keeping them in the air, you throw them at the goals and hope they hit. And then if they hit, you get even more balls to juggle until they actually become projects, right? So it was really inspiring to me to have a lot of people around me who were doing similar sorts of juggling, managing like a lot of projects.
Right, I just remember like the workshop experiences in Yale creative writing classes. Everyone was just writing multiple things at the same time.
Exactly.
And trying to work that out. And what it's like to, you mentioned your creative process when you were doing the Tea House of the Gods.
Mm-hmm.
You said that's not something you would like to repeat again for your quality of life or writing, but it's kind of amazing, especially to me as an English major, that you are able to do a part-time software engineering master's full-time job while keeping up your passion in writing. So how are you able to find that work-writing balance? And do you think your job necessarily has a connection, or does it not have to?
Mm-hmm. So there are 2 questions here. The first thing that I think is more useful that I'll address first is like finding a balance between your day-to-day work and your passions, right? I think there's 3 ways to go about doing this. One is, like you said, work-life balance. So having a job that gets you spare time to do the things that you want, regardless of what the job is. The job provides for your living necessities of well-lit room, food, shelter. There's also the approach of, so a lot of the internships that I did during college were marketing for, a lot of the internships that I did during college were marketing, and that I was telling some of the most visible stories in the world, right, to audiences. So that was another way of trying to get at my passions while working on them into my day-to-day job. So that's the second option, do something that relates to your passions. And then finally, the last one, which is to make your passion into a full-time day job. So this is something that I've gotten a lot of advice as someone who's interested in the creative world about, like, what if you end up doing your passion as your full-time job and you hate it? Right. But then like, what if you start out doing something you hate, and then you just hate it throughout, right? Is that any better necessarily? But the issue with most creative lives is that there is like an income trajectory,
right.
And it tends to start out very low. So it's not only a matter of do I want to do this, but also a matter of building up an income stream that can replace your
You're very poor until you're suddenly very rich. Is at least the outside opinion for creative writers.
Exactly, and if I were to do a talk, I think about navigating the career process, it would be called How to Be an Artist with Starving crossed out between an artist. It's the financial aspect of managing that. Like I mentioned, Yale is a school where 69% of students are in the top 20% of the income bracket. So a lot of people have money. If that's not the case, then you make your own.
Yeah, I can imagine many artists would like to come to the talk of how to not starve while maintaining their artistry. And Yale is, in a sense, a skill model of society, at least part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You mentioned your career writing experiences, especially with like-minded people at Yale. What about outside of Yale? Once you've began writing outside of a college environment, what's the writing scene like here in Beijing or in America?
So let's start with the writing scene in general. The type of writing that I was exposed to at Yale is a very literary stream, which if we are talking about, there's like publishers, so publishers are one of the big organizers of this world of storytelling, right? They get their money from publications like magazine, like genre fiction, and their money is used to support purchases like the literary funds. So one great thing about the literary projects is that they can be very unrelated to profitability. People are interested in reading stories. People are interested in publishing the next, say, like Walden. Regardless of how well Walden sells, publishers want to be the people who have brought that sort of storytelling onto the scene. So as a result, as a literary writer, your income is tied less to the day-to-day sales.
I see.
But unfortunately, there is also an approach. What I love about popular fiction, right, is its visibility. Like, these are the stories that I grow up writing.
Right.
These are the stories that I want to tell. But that's another process of navigating, in that in the modern day, there will be less and less stories like Harry Potter, because there's no longer like a publisher monopoly. There's much more sources of media and places to spread people's attention. So Netflix, one of the ways they run their business, right, is by having a lot of IPs and selling different stories. That's how they differentiate themselves from competitors, in having access to lots of stories to be able to entertain you and take up your time. So as a creator, this is really exciting for us, in that they want lots of IPs, they're hungry for different stories, but it's also challenging in that it's harder to make a big story than ever before, because attention is being drawn in so many different ways.
It's very hard to be the one right now.
Exactly, but it might be a bit easier to make something.
Right.
So it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be putting out projects.
I see. Yeah. And any particular experiences with the Beijing writing scene?
Yes. Thank you for following up. So there's two Beijing groups that I've written with when I was here in 2017-18 that I'm happy to connect anyone with if they're interested. One is Spittoon, which is the Beijing bilingual, multilingual literary magazine for mainly fiction. And then the other is an organization of like about 500 people called the Beijing's Writers Network, which tries to meet about once a month and do some readings. I ran that for about half a year while I was here. It's very informal. They're very chill. It's just nice to have a nice place to share your stories. The one drawback is that being English writers in Beijing, it's an expat community. People move through very quickly, so it's still important to build like your own network of friends.
I see. Yeah, it's nice when you're a writer to not be the only writer that you know.
No, it's terribly lonely. Like
Yeah.
typing 250,000 words by yourself.
You gotta have some friends to look at the stories at least.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's so interesting about like digital and modern media, in that I can write something, have it online, have feedback about it within a day.
Right,
And then be able
having
to
comments
decide
like the ones you showed in the
to
slide.
that. Exactly, that's
Yeah.
why I find new media so exciting.
Yeah, that's that sounds amazing, and thank you for sharing those writing circles with us. And let's go back to your Yale experiences a little bit. We mentioned your fellow writers a lot. What about the people that taught writing to you at Yale? I know that Yale often has outside writers, famous writers come and teach seminars and workshops. At least that's what they. I imagine that nothing much changed over 2 years apart that we're at Yale. So who are some of the writers you encountered, and what are some classes that you remember most clearly?
Yeah. So the class I probably remember most clearly is Intro to Fiction with Michael Cunningham.
I took his class.
Yes, who later became my thesis advisor
for
this project, and who I've stayed in touch with, for years since. So after I received the contract for my first game, I wrote to some of my professors and was like, help, help. I have an 8-page legal document in my email that I hypothetically need to sign, and I am not at all qualified to do this. So it was, first of all, I really appreciate the professors for what they taught me in the course about how to write. But also, after leaving college, I have realized so much of the professional experience in building a career has nothing to do with actually just putting words on a page.
Right.
So I've been very appreciative because of how small the classes were, and being able to sort of build a connection with my classmates and students and teachers, but also how professors have continued to be supportive of my work afterwards, so helping me negotiate the contract. And now that I have had these experiences and been able to ask more questions, helping me navigate the process of growing as a writer and how exactly that works.
Was he already holding office hours in the study hotel?
Yes.
Or,
All of our thesis meeting sessions were in the study.
Yeah. He also tried to get us out to drinks after finals in a semester.
Yeah. He usually does that for his courses. It's he's a very classy gentleman.
Yeah. We can reminisce about Professor Cunningham later on. But what are some of your advice to young aspiring writers, as I'm sure there are many in the audience here tonight, as perhaps Michael Cunningham helped you? What are some words you would like to share with aspiring Chinese writers here?
Right. I think the general tactical is what I said about the process of you are juggling 5 balls and throwing them at whatever opportunities. That is what the professional process will be like, and something you should be prepared to do, or at least think a lot about doing, and that it's aside from just the writing on the page, right?
Right.
The process that goes into it. It's very important to learn about the whole industry, at least to me and the way I particularly approach things, to learn about the industry, the financial forces, and especially legal protections. So one very specific tactical advice is, whenever someone offers you a contract, do not sign it until you have had a legal opinion, or at least have some confidence in that you understand what you're signing. Because these are your rights, and this is your profitability and your income sources later. It's also learning to navigate this professional process will help prepare you for the aspect of writing that's not only publishing stories, but also supporting yourself and making a career out of it.
Yeah, some very valuable advice, especially about the practical side of writing, that I don't think, especially writers who are starting off, we often don't think about those things when we really should be thinking about them. Yeah.
It's something I'm still learning how to think about as well.
And to risk being overly broad as a question, as a writer yourself, why do you think we need creative writing, be it fiction or nonfiction, in society?
So I actually spent most of my life in Kentucky, and this is something I will always remember from high school in Kentucky. One of my English teachers taught, because I actually started out as pre-med. So one of my English teachers was talking about the difference between STEM and the humanities, right? And the way he thought about STEM was, it's the science that teaches us how to get from point A to point B. But humanities is what we use to think about where we're going. And it's not just the process of getting from A to point B, but also thinking about where we're going. That's something that that I'm curious about doing.
Yeah, that's one of life's biggest questions, right? Where we come from, where we're going.
I have not answered the question, but humanities is helping me hypothetically figure it out.
At least we're posing the question, we're posing the question, and we're trying to answer it. And it's the process that matters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And last but definitely not least, what is something you would recommend all of us read? Or see, depending.
So I'm someone who threw Devil May Cry on this PowerPoint, so I'm just going to go out there and be like, do people watch anime?
What? Some?
Raise your hand if you watch anime or read manga. 看漫画的，举手。Okay, so I'm really into Gintama recently, and I think just what I find interesting about a lot of shonen manga and a lot of shonen stories and YA stories, which is the genre I'm interested in, is about people who are 18, right? Except what I find really interesting about Gintama is you are taking someone who's pushing 30, or and making him the hero of a shonen story. So it's a story about so after Japan was taken over by aliens, these are the heroes, the samurai, who have tried to fight the aliens and failed. So thinking about, as a hero, what happens after the story? So what happens after you fail? And how do you deal with failure? And how do you live a good life? Is something I think, is something that I think we can all learn a lot from, because life won't always be all about success. And it's the process of living a good life after the hero's journey that I am now trying to learn what a good life looks like for me.
All right. Thank you for the recommendation. I guess we'll check out that after today. And now let's throw it to the audience. See if you guys have any questions.